Hello, good morning from Germany. Yes, I have moved from Germany to, no, wait, from Singapore to Germany. And yeah, thank you for your patience. I am still producing content, but I've been quite busy trying to settle down in a new environment. So in this video, I am going to go over a topic that is so fundamental in economics. And you might have guessed it right, applications of elasticities of demand, right? So that is one of the first few chapters in econs, right, that you would have learned. And just a reminder to please check the syllabus requirements for appropriate guidance. And yet again, I'm going to take on an exam-oriented approach. So the problem situation is as such: car brands have different models whose sales are affected in varied manners by changes in cost of production and incomes. So in IB, that would be paper 1, and in Singapore's A levels, that would be paper 2 if you are doing H2, right? So you get a 10-15 marks split in this in these syllabuses, right? So part A, explain how elasticities of demand are used to understand the impact of part 1, a rise in cost of production, and part 2, a rise in incomes on the sales volume of different car models. 10 marks. And part B, using real world examples, discuss the combined impact of both changes on the sales revenue earned from different car models. Yeah. So, the 4-part series are actually going to be surrounding this question, this 25-mark question. So I'm going to break it down into 4 parts. So the first 2 parts obviously will center on part A. And in this first part of the 4-part series, I'll address half of the requirements for part A, which essentially is the first part, a rise in cost of production, right? So first of all, sales volume can be approximated by the market equilibrium quantity. And a recap: market equilibrium is a situation whereby there is no tendency for changes in the market. This occurs at the point where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. That means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Right. So the rise in income, which essentially means rise in demand, and rise in cost of car manufacture, which means a fall in supply, will cause changes in the market equilibrium, affecting both price and quantity. So for part A, you should be using the price elasticity of demand, PED, and the income elasticity of demand, YED, to illustrate the degree of the changes on equilibrium quantity and thus sales volume. Right. So for the supply factor, which is the first part of the question, the rise in cost of production, we've got therefore supply decreasing and equilibrium quantity will decrease, hence leading to a fall in sales volume. Now, the extent of the fall in sales volume will depend on the price elasticity of demand for car models. So I've got, first of all, the supply curve, the original supply curve, which is S0. So remember that fall in supply is represented by a leftward shift of the supply curve. And if demand were price elastic, the slope of the demand curve would be gentler. And you could see that the resultant equilibrium at E1 would be accompanied by the corresponding price P1 and quantity Q1. But if demand were price inelastic, which means that the demand curve would have a relatively steeper slope, then the resultant equilibrium E2 would correspond to price P2 and quantity Q2. And importantly, you would see that the extent of the fall in quantity demanded for the case in red, which is that demand is price elastic, is going to be greater than the extent of the fall in quantity demanded that's in blue, and that's when the demand is price inelastic. Right, so an exam tip for all students, the original equilibrium should be the same for both cases at E0. I always tell my students that, it's like running a science experiment. Your starting point should be the same, right, at E0. And therefore you would have price P0 initially, and the initial quantity is at Q0, right, which is so a quick recap. PED is always negative. Well, at least for most goods of concern, if the good obeys the law of demand, and we drop the negative sign by convention sometimes. Anyways, the magnitude of the PED is of greater concern to us in this question. It tells us the type of demand that the good has. In other words, is demand price elastic or price inelastic? And you should have already learned this. So what are the determinants of PED? And if you're not too sure, you should definitely go back to reading your textbook or your notes, right? So, because that's so crucial in answering this question. Now, I've got a picture here of more upmarket models produced by Mercedes-Benz. And basically, what I'm trying to illustrate is via these examples, right? So for upmarket car models such as Mercedes, AMG, and Audi RS, the demand for these cars is relatively price elastic. So the magnitude is likely going to be higher than 1 because consumers spend a large proportion of their income on them. So that's one determinant. And these car models are usually viewed as having a low degree of necessity because it's not essential to drive an upmarket car as a mode of transport. So given a rise in price due to the fall in supply, the quantity demanded for these upmarket car models will decrease more than proportionately to the rise in price. And therefore, we can see that the sales volume decreases by a larger extent. So remember this diagram that I showed you earlier? Now, I am going to have to tell you to ignore the portions in blue because that's not really applicable, right? As we have justified that demand for cars is price elastic, right? So we are going to remove the portions in blue. And as you can see, the quantity demanded falls by more than proportionately, okay, Q0 dropping to Q1, more than proportionately to the rise in price, which is represented by P0 rising to P1. Okay, now let's look at other car models, right? We've got a Grand i10 Neos by Hyundai here. So for more economy car models such as Hyundai Grand i10 Neos and Nissan Versa, the demand for these cars is relatively price inelastic. So in terms of magnitude of the PED, it's going to be lower than 1 because the proportion of income spent is much lower and the degree of necessity is relatively high, as it arguably is an essential form of transport for some commuters. So given a rise in price due to the fall in supply, we've got quantity demanded for cars decreasing less than proportionately. So sales volume would decrease by a smaller extent. And same diagram as I showed you several slides earlier, except that this time remove the portions in red, right? So as you can see, the fall in quantity demanded from Q0 to Q2 is less than proportionate to the rise in price, right? P0 to P2 in this case. And therefore, we can conclude that sales volume decreases by a small extent for more economy models of cars. Right. So I just want to highlight some common pitfalls that students might make, right? First, pairing PED with the change in demand, that it's an absolute no-no. You would have noticed that I paired PED with a change in supply, not a change in demand. Some students have also, misinterpreted the question, perhaps, thinking that sales volume is represented by price times quantity. That's actually sales revenue, not sales volume. Sales volume is just Q, right? The letter Q. All right. And that's it for this first part. We will address part A, part 2 in the second part of this 4-part series, so stay tuned. And just a reminder that I do offer tutoring via Skype. So if you've got inquiries related to tutoring, please drop me an email. And also, please subscribe to my channel if, it's been of interest to you or it's benefited you in some ways. All right. That's it for today. Goodbye.